Okay, hi, this is Mike from Woodcraft, and we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different woodworking tools that are good to have when you're starting out.
Good morning. This is Jim at the Woodcraft store again. We're here to talk about some of the hand tools that you would need to start up.
What I have here is what I consider my essential hand saw. It's a Japanese thing, so if you're used to Western saws, it's going to look strange, but it does the same thing that Western saws do. There will be a Western saw that does cross cutting, and there will be a Western saw that does rip cutting. Cross cutting is across the grain, rip cutting is along the grain. This does both. So I'm not saying give up your Western tools, but I love this. It's very sharp. It has a replaceable blade. It has different sized blades. So if you're going to be doing something fairly delicate, you can get a smaller blade with finer teeth. This is a 210 millimeter blade, my preferred blade for this kind of saw. The most common one you'll find is 240. So if you go to any other store and any other brand, you're going to get 240 millimeter. Not ideal. It's a little coarse. But the Guayacucho brand with the rattan handle, they do 210, 240. I have a 270, which is a monster I bought just for entertainment purposes. I think there's a 310, but it's like, I don't want to be in the room when that comes out of it. Anyway, they last for years. Eventually you'll have to get rid of the blade, keep the handle, buy a new blade, and you're good to go.
Today I'm going to cover a few of the items that are essential to have, and one of them is screwdrivers. You have your standalone Phillips head screwdriver, which sort of looks like a plus sign on the top. I've got two sizes out here, a large one and a small one. You really need to have two different sizes. You also have to have the slotted screwdriver, and I have three sizes here: a large one, a medium-sized one, and a small one. The nice thing about these are, at least these, they're magnetic. You can't see it here because the tip is a little heavy, but it will hold the screw in place as you start to work, so that it sort of frees up one hand to hold it. You're not worried about holding the screw in that. You can do several different things. It's nice to have the standalone, but it's also nice to have one of the multi screwdrivers. Now the multi screwdriver, this one is a very nice one. It has a place for you to keep your bits in the handle so they don't get lost. This one comes with a set of two Phillips head screwdriver bits, a large and a small, two slotted head screwdriver bits, a large and a small, and two square driver bits. Square driver bits are screws that now have square heads or square driving setups on them, and they work really nicely. They work better than Phillips heads, and they come in many sizes. The thing about this one is that all your bits are stored in the handle, so you don't need an extra spot to keep them, to store them. You're not always fumbling for them. There are a couple of these that are known as 7-in-1 tools, where you actually pull them out, reverse them, and change the bits. The other nice thing about these is, since this is a 1/4-inch driving head, you can drive screws that have 1/4-inch hex heads on them, and they become very easy, and you're not going in and out looking for a socket. On this tool, or this screwdriver, it has a couple added features that most of the other ones don't. You can use it as a mini screwdriver. You push down the collet and it extends it so that you can have it a longer screwdriver, so you have a longer reach. And when you're done with it for storage, you push down the collet and you put it back in.
What I have here is a very essential thing in a shop, which is a tape measure, which is a measuring device on a tape. It's great if you're doing very large stuff to have a tape measure so stiff that you can extend it out across the room before it flops. So it's nice to have one that's like 1 inch wide, 25 feet long, but it's incredibly ungainly if you're working on small stuff in the shop. So I like to have two. I like to have a 12-foot one that's small and compact. I can put it in my pocket right here. But I like to have the 25-footer if I'm doing larger, bigger things. So you'll buy them as you need them, but don't be surprised if you need at least two.
I have an assortment here. This is a 1" by 8 screw. The 8 is the diameter of the screw. The 1" is the length of the screw. And these are all Phillips heads, which means the cross or plus sign on the screws. And they come in various lengths. 8" you would use a 1/8" drill bit to pre-drill the hole, or one slightly smaller. You make it about the same length, depth as the screw is long. We have some 1.5" or 1 5/8" screws, which are great for holding things together, and some number 9s by 2.5", which you would be using if you were putting some decking down and something longer. You want the screw to go at least as far through the wood as the wood is thick. So if you're using a 3/4 inch board screwing into a board that's a 2x4, you want the screw to go into the 2x4 at least 3/4 inch. So if you're 1" there, so you need a minimum of 1.5" screws. When you start using nails, you want to use the same philosophy. Nails are harder to take out. Nails are easier to bend. So my personal preference is to use screws all the time.
What I have here is something we don't want to talk about, but it's a fact of life. Splinters. You will get splinters. They are unpleasant. You want to be able to get them out in a hurry. And this thing here used to be called sliver grippers. I'm not sure they changed the name or not. These are fantastic. They're inexpensive and they're very effective. You can put them on your keychain. You don't ever have to be without them. You should not be without tweezers.
One of the things that you're going to need to own when you're working in your shop or working at home or setting up something to work with is you're going to need a hammer and you're going to need a mallet. The hammers come in a variety of sizes. Right now we have 2 hammers that are called claw hammers. The reason they're called claw hammers is that they have the bent claw, which is allowed for pulling out nails. I have 2 sizes here. This one is an 8-ounce finishing hammer. This is a 16-ounce framing hammer. There is also another hammer out there, or other hammers out there that get larger. They have a straight claw compared to the curved claw. If you're just using it at home, you're not going to go build a house or something, these come in perfectly great for you. Hammers also come with a different kind of face on them. These are nice flat face. Some come with a checkered face. The checkered face is great for framing and construction work, but is very bad for finish work and working on things like that. So you want to make sure that you have at least 1 hammer in your repertoire of tools. A 16-ounce hammer is preferable, but if you're going to do small stuff, if you get into things like making dollhouse furniture, things like that, you probably want to use the smaller hammer. The 7 or 8-ounce hammer works very nicely. Another trick that I'll mention is that if you're putting in small nails, take a comb, put the nails between the couple of teeth of the comb, and that way you can start your nail in and your fingers are out of the way. You're not going to end up with bruised fingers, the black fingernails from pounding your fingernails. Along with hammers, we have a couple of things called mallets. Mallets come in a variety of sizes and shape. This one's a rubber mallet. This one is a dead blow mallet. This one has a lot of shot inside so that when you use it to hit something, it has a little bit more force. This is nice if you want to move a couple of things, alter it, get everything to line up perfectly before you start putting your nails in it. These generally do not mar your project that you're working on, so they become in hand. If you're working with a chisel, you can use a hammer. Some of the chisels have a metal cap on the top, which works really great with hammers. If it doesn't have a metal cap on the top, you want to use a mallet, either a wooden one, a rubber mallet, or a dead blow mallet. The reason why you want to use a mallet with a chisel that doesn't have a metal cap on it is that the hammer will just destroy the end of the chisel and you'll have more of a problem than it's worth.
Another standard tool for in the shop is something called a combination square. It's called a combination square because it does a combination of things. It does 90 degrees or square, as they call it in the business, 45 degrees, which is very handy, and you can loosen this little brass knob and make it stick out a long bit or a short bit, so you can actually use it for a depth gauge, and you can use it for drawing along an edge of something. It really is a fantastic tool, and I was a woodworker for maybe 2 or 3 years before I bought one, and I was just like, what was I thinking? So this is a 12-inch combination square. It's good if you're doing larger furniture things. If you're doing smaller things, a 6-inch one is good, because this is just ungainly for small stuff. So it's one more tool where you may end up with the big one and a little one. And I know a guy who's got one that's 36 inches long. Crazy. But 12 inches and 6 inches are pretty standard. There are various different qualities of them. If you buy a cheap one, it's unlikely to be square or to stay square. So research it and make sure you get one that is good, or learn how to make it square yourself, which is interesting. But don't cheap out on something like this. It should be square.
Now, when you're building a project, it doesn't matter what project you're working on, you need to have a way to hold it together as you're putting it together. That comes into the category of clamps. There's a variety of kinds of clamps. You have, these are called F clamps because they sort of look like an F when they're rearranged so that you can get them to the height you want. They come in handy for keeping things clamped together while you're adjusting them. They're easily adjustable. This is probably the most expensive part of tools that you will need for your home shop. They come in short little ones like this. You come up to a medium size like this. You come up to the longer ones like this. And then you get into the real long ones. Clamps are not inexpensive. We have this other style like this. It's called a pony clamp, where it's actually a piece of pipe. You buy these, this comes separately, and then you can buy a piece of pipe, whatever length you want for what you're doing. This is sometimes the best way to go, but you can never have enough clamps, and as you're working on them, they work well. The other kind of clamp is a ratchet clamp. So this gives you another option to have a third hand. They work really great. They're adjustable. And some of these are designed so that you can take them apart, put this part on backwards, and work it for taking apart something. Maybe you have a chair that the stretchers have come loose on and you want to re-glue the stretchers, but you don't want to destroy the chair by banging on it with a mallet or a hammer. You want to take one of these clamps that's reversible, you slide this off, put it on backwards, and instead of clamping up, it expands, so it'll allow you to take it apart without destroying it.
What we have here is a starter set of chisels. These are called bench chisels because you would use them around the bench more than any other chisel. They're not too long, they're not too short, anything like that. They also go by the name bevel edge chisels because the sides are beveled. But a lot of chisels are bevel edge, including very short chisels that aren't bench chisels, blah, blah, blah. So, bench chisels are bevel edge chisels of a certain length. Good at just about everything. So this is what you start with, a set of 4 or 5. There's the Woodcraft Wood River brand. There's lots of other brands. You buy a set of 3 or 4 or 5. I think 4 or 5 is common. And if you're on the mailing list for the catalog, they'll send you sales flyers. That's a good time to buy a set of chisels. You don't want to be without it. If you buy a larger set of 5 or 6 or something, you're going to end up with chisels that you probably never use. This is really good for starter set, basic 4.
Now we get to talk a little bit about the part that is the most time-consuming part of building a project and getting it to the point where you're going to finish it. And that's the sanding. Sanding takes a lot of time, and the more time you spend sanding, the better your finish comes on your project. It gets rid of all the flaws, all the marks, all the scratches that came in. You get rid of the ding marks from the hammers and things like that. and it takes time. It takes a lot of time, and you spend more time sanding, getting it ready to finish, than you do actually doing the finishing of the building of it. I have in front of me a variety of different grits of sandpaper. The lower the number, the rougher the grit. The higher the number, the finer the grit. It's called sandpaper because when it was originally started, they used to just put a piece of paper down, put glue on it, and sprinkle sand on top of it with the different size grits. Today, it's called abrasive paper. It's synthetic. It's made of aluminum oxide. You can get it so that you can use wet, dry sandpaper. In other words, you can sand something with water and it'll give you a better finish. But you don't want to do that on wood. That's more for plastic or acrylics and things like that. 80 grit is the roughest, and that's what you usually start with. You then move into 100 grit. 120 grit is a medium grit. 180 grit is a finer grit than the 120. And then we have 220, which is a finished grit. And beyond 220, there's 320, 400, 500, and goes all the way up to 1,000. I've worked with a couple of people who want to make their finish look like a mirror finish, and they work it all the way up to 2,000, 3,000 grit sandpaper. It gets a little extreme. The other thing when you're working with sandpaper, you want to have a block to put your sandpaper on so that you keep your surface flat. If you're just trying it by hand, you may put divots and valleys in it. So it's always nice to have a block in which you put your sandpaper on, and it allows you to work on it flat. It also allows you to work on the corners and work on that a little easier. There's also sandpaper that comes in foam pads. It's glued to the foam pads, and this will get you into curves and radiuses in areas where you want to work that a flat block like this will not work. So this is something else. These are really nice. These are, they form to the contour of what you're doing. If you're working on something that's round or cove shape or moldings, these will push to that shape and work really well. Sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you want to take a piece of sandpaper, wrap it around a piece of dowel to get into a rounded area that works really well. So let your imagination run a little bit when you're working with sandpaper, but the most important thing to remember is when you start with 80, you want to go all the way up to 220, because each time you move up, you're making your scratches smaller and smaller and smaller. You're making more of them, then they become less and less visible. It also makes the finish better. So take the time to spend the sanding. It takes a lot longer than you think. You want to make sure you have a really good finish, because if you put your finish on and your scratches and start to show up when your finish is on, you're taking the finish off and sanding through the finish down to bare wood again.
I mentioned chisels a little while ago. It seems like hours ago. If you're going to get any kind of edge tools, you need something to keep them sharp. Not someday. When you buy edge tools, that same day, buy sharpening stones or whatever sharpening gizmo you're going to use. I learned on sharpening. I sharpened on sharpening stones for 30 years, and they work just fine. I eventually bought the Work Sharp, and I was like, I didn't know it could be so good. But that's a lot of money for starting out. So this is one stone. It's called a combination stone, and it's wrapped in a combination of packages. Perhaps that's why. It's like Christmas. So if we didn't edit all that out, that's what it's like to open stuff on camera. So what this is a stone that is 1,000 grit on one side, 4,000 on the other. What that means is that on the 1,000 grit, there's abrasive particles in there that are so small that you have to line up 1,000 of them to span 1 inch. And on the 4,000 grit side, you have to use 4,000 of them to span 1 inch. So the larger number means a smaller particle size. So it's sort of opposite land. You need 1,000 grit stone bare minimum. Then you need something like a 4,000 grit to get the rough scratches from the 1,000 out of there. And this is for starters. You probably want a 6,000 and or 8,000 grit stone when you're done. So these are water stones. Usually you would soak them in water before use and then dry them off. The stones these days will come with instructions on whether or not to do that. But you need at least a 1,000 grit and 4,000 grit stone. And the cheapest way to start is by getting what's called a combination stone.
Yeah.
Hold on. All right, there you go.
Coping saw. Coping saw is a small hand saw that will get into small places. This is not designed for cutting long straight cuts. This is designed for cutting curves, cutting rounded radiuses, cutting small pieces. It has a very small blade. It has a large frame so that you can work around what you're cutting on. Its teeth are small, it's thin, it's easily twisted. When you put a blade in a coping saw, you always put the teeth pointing down so that when you're cutting on the downstroke rather than the upstroke. When you cut on the downstroke, if you're holding your material against the bench and you're cutting as you're coming down, it also holds the material against the bench rather than lifting up. The other thing, when you're cutting with a coping saw, you pull down, you pull it out a little bit, raise it back up. You don't drag the teeth back and forth in your cut or the kerf of your cut, because that will just dull the teeth. The other thing that happens is these blades tend to get hot when you're working with them, so you really don't want to touch them after you've been cutting because they will burn you. It's nice also to have a few extra blades on hand when you're cutting, because if you break one, you're not running out to the store to buy one, or you're not dead in your tracks on your project until you have to come back and get it. And what's nice is that you can set this up and you can turn the blade so that it'll go in different directions, but most of the time you will be finding this works on small pieces that you're working on.
If you're going to do any kind of handwork at all, you need to have at least a couple of hand planes. This is a number 4, also known as a smoothing plane. And originally Stanley made planes from number 1 size, which is this size, shape, tiny, and then bigger and wider until you get to number 8, which is about this long. And I call it the aircraft carrier because it's so big. So from 1 to 8, the numbers have a logical sequence, and after that their number system is random. Anyway, a common first plane would be a 4 or a 5. I like the 4 because it's easy to handle. This particular one is in the old bedrock style. So you see that flat side right there. That's basically the best Stanley ever made, and this is a copy of that, and these are really good. So they are, but this is a block plane. And I don't remember all the Stanley numbers for block planes, and I'm not going to try to remember, but you want one that fits comfortably in your hand. This is a little wide for me. I would rather have one a little narrower, but the great thing is that it does generally fit in your hand, and it is what's called bevel up. So the blade has the bevel facing up, which is not true of the regular bench planes. The regular bench planes have the bevel down. These bevel up allow you to cut at a very low angle, which can be handy if you're cutting end grain. And block planes were originally designed for cutting end grain. Wood blocks that were used for doing illustrations in newspapers and catalogs back in the day were literally cut into wooden end grain blocks. And this is the plane that was designed, literally designed, to cut the end grain on those blocks. So this is great for end grain or little bits and pieces. So it's great for awkward spots. Talk about, let's see, this is an everyday pencil, although it's a little fancier than normal, but this is the good old Ticonderoga number 2 pencil. You need regular pencils as well as a 0.5 millimeter mechanical pencil, which I don't have on me, but they're very common in any office supply store. You need both because the mechanical pencils will be very good for doing careful layout work when you're drawing on your wood. So this is a number 2 pencil. It's a Ticonderoga brand. It's the only brand that is basically good enough that it won't break when you're trying to sharpen it. So if you buy like 100 pencils for $2 at an office supply store, you get what you pay for. So get the Ticonderogas if you're going to buy regular pencils. Sharpie marker or something like that is often handy. So these are all important things to have. When you're starting out in woodworking, surprisingly, one of the best things you can do is get a catalog or a series of catalogs, and you want to go through them and find out what they call things and what they're for. How many different kinds of hand saws are there and why? Well, it will be in there with pictures and descriptions to show you. So if you can refrain from buying everything you read about, it's a safe way to learn. So I recommend catalogs as an illustrated guide to what's available.